everyone, my name is Jason Hagen, and today I wanted to make a video about the riots and protests that are occurring in Minneapolis and in cities across the United States in response to the murder of George Floyd and to the murder of many other innocent African Americans who fell as a casualty to the continuing violence of police brutality in the United States of America. And I wanted to provide some clarity about the situation, talk about some of the facts that are part of the case, and also go over a lot of the causes present in our society of the cruelty in our criminal justice system, especially towards African Americans, and talk about a very important quote said by Martin Luther King Jr. Many years back that I think applies a lot to the situation that we're going through today. So to start off, I'm going to be looking at an article from CNN that discusses the record of Derek Chauvin and another one of the four protesters present when George Floyd was murdered. And I think the article can speak for itself here. The former Minneapolis police officer, seen in a video with his knee on George Floyd's neck, had 18 prior complaints filed against him with the Minneapolis Police Department's internal affairs, according to the police department. It's unclear what the internal affairs complaints against the officer, Derek Chauvin, were for. MPD did not provide additional details. I'd like to go on and also say that the article states further that only 2 of the 18 complaints against Chauvin were closed with discipline. So only 2 out of 18 led to some sort of discipline coming onto Chauvin, according to a MPD Internal Affairs public summary. In both cases, the discipline issued column indicated that a letter of reprimand had been issued in response. So, for only 2 of the 18 instances of complaints, which came earlier, against Chauvin, only the 2 of them were, the response was that of a simple letter of reprimand, no real consequences. And so what kind of message does that make it look like the MPD is giving to its officers about police misconduct? Let's continue on. Another one of the officers present was Totau, which he had 6 complaints filed with Internal Affairs, one of which was still open, according to the public summary released Thursday. The other 5 complaints had been closed without discipline. So not only did the other 5 complaints lead to no forms of discipline, but one of them was still open, and he was out there on the job, despite the fact that there was an open case for some level of police misconduct. And so I think that it says a lot about how often police officers don't get the proper consequences for stepping out of the bounds of the job that they're given, for going further than what they're allowed to do within their level of force and responsibility. And maybe if some of those complaints had received a proper consequence, George Floyd might not have faced the same fate that he faced on that day. But let's continue, because, that's 2 officers. That's only 2 officers in the Minneapolis Police Department that I can talk about there being a real issue with them there. So let's take a broader look, right? Let's look at the specific statistics present within the Minneapolis Police Department. So let's look here. Black people make up about 18% of Minneapolis's population, but they had a disproportionate share of interactions with police between October 31st, 2016 and October 12th, 2017. So black people make 18% of Minneapolis' population, but have been subjected to 45.7% of investigative stops, 44% of moving violations, 52% of equipment violations, 63% of vehicle searches, 61.6% of searches of person, 51.2% of citations, and 57% of bookings. What does that say about the possibility that there's some problem with racial profiling within the Minneapolis Police Department? Do we really think that black people deserve this level of a disproportionate amount of vehicle searches? Do they really commit that level more crime than their white counterparts in the city of Minneapolis, I find that hard to believe because these numbers suggest that the average black person in Minneapolis is much more dangerous than the average white person. And I think that's just very, very well not true. And I think it's evident of the fact that there's a large amount of racial profiling present within the police department in Minneapolis. So that's just showing that it isn't just a problem of a couple cops. It seems to be a more systemic issue within the Minneapolis Police Department, and that might suggest things that are happening in police departments across this country. So clearly, we're seeing disproportionate amounts of police activity against minorities, especially black people. Clearly. These numbers support it from the Minneapolis Police Department itself. So that really can't be argued with. And so I think this is just a tiny fraction of the issue, right? Like there's the issue, like there's the story of driving while black, where cops just are all the time more suspicious of people of color when they're driving, even for no reason. Stops for things that are frankly inconsequential and that a white person would not be stopped for. And then we've also seen from the other cases of police brutality that often these routine stops are the things that turn deadly, where the cop asks for some form of ID, and then the person in the front of the car reaches for their ID, and then the cop mistakes that for grabbing a firearm or something, and then kills them. That's similar to what happened with the Philando Castile incident. I mean, with basically any incident where there's trouble at a stop. So again, not just proof that black people are being harassed to a greater extent than whites, but that these kinds of things like investigative stops and vehicle searches, these are the things that can escalate into situations where police brutality often occur. But again, this data applies specifically to the Minneapolis Police Department, and I could see people saying, well, what about things that apply to the entire country? And so I think that there are issues that are very prevalent. And I could talk for a lot about them now, but that would be way too long. And I think I might make videos about each specific issue later on. But right now I'll just do a very brief, I'll just call out the names of the things that I think contribute to the high amounts of inequity in the criminal justice system and that lead to the very clear oppression of racial minorities within our criminal justice system. So the first, the most obvious, police brutality. That's the one that gets the most time on the news. That's what happened to George Floyd. That's what happened to Michael Brown Jr. That's what happened to Tamir Rice. It's been on the news. Everybody knows about it. But there's other issues as well. The first is police militarization. Ever since the 1980s, there's been a trend of giving police forces higher grade and more dangerous military weapons without necessarily training them in how to properly use them. That's been super common. And by the way, for every issue I'm going to mention, I'm going to have a corresponding link in the description. So if you want to start looking for yourself about these issues and learning, anything I reference today and more will be in the description for you to go learn more about. Another thing is unjust sentencing. So the first thing that comes to mind is mandatory minimums, which was were more set up in the 1990s, which basically said for this crime, it's not up to the judge's discretion how many years somebody should get. It's everybody needs to get at least 10 years or something like that. And so what this led to is, you're forcing people to go into jail for much longer years. And considering, as that police data showed earlier, that the majority of bookings are African Americans, you could see if more black people are arrested and put on trial and often convicted, then this mandatory minimum law that says it's not up to the judge's discretion, everybody needs to receive a certain number of years, that can lead to people spending more time in jail than is just. Three strikes laws, also a relic of the 90s that continues on to today. If you commit crimes 3 times, the last time, your sentence is going to be way longer. And that has shown to contribute to prison overcrowding and many other terrible things. The prison industrial complex, that deserves an enormous video within itself. but basically it's a system which within private for-profit prisons fund politicians to keep their agenda going and make sure that they can profit off jailing people. And that leads to a lot of perverse incentives about how to run our system. Very complicated issue. I will definitely make a video about that. And again, all of these have links to articles that cover these issues, at least in the basics, and can give you room to learn more. The next is the school to prison pipeline. Basically, the issue that, especially for minorities, especially for black people that live in underfunded school districts, right? You go to a school district where there's not the proper level of funding. There are all these problems within the system. And that leads to a lot of kids just not being able to find a good future for themselves. And they often live in communities where economic opportunity isn't very present, leading many who are faced with poverty uh, to pursue crime, just in simply in order to live and pay the bills. And so, what that school to prison pipeline means is that we're quite literally funding schools too little and prisons too much, and having people go to school not getting the proper education they need, not getting the right economic opportunities, and that inevitably leading to prison. Last thing, the cash bail system. The United States is like the only modern developed country that continues with this. If you are arrested, you can pay bail to basically not have to wait in jail until your trial. But most people who are underprivileged and do not have enough money to pay bail, and these people are disproportionately African American, are not able to pay bail, right? And I think this article cites a statistic about something like 70% of people in jail right now are pretrial detainees. That means they're people who have not been committed guilty of a crime. They're not criminals because we have presumption of innocence in this country, but they are still rotting in jails. And I think that statement itself is shocking, and that proves that we need to change things. But again, that article will be linked down below, and please read and learn, because this is the time where we need to inform ourselves so that we can make change that we need to do and support the right candidates and support the right people and fund the right organizations. And so I think that's just a list of the basics in terms of big name inequities that exist within our system. There are many more things besides that, and I'm going to cover more things in depth later on, especially if you guys are interested. If there's a specific topic that you want to see covered more, please comment down below. Please and then we can look furthermore at subjects like that, take a deeper dive, look at what the root problems are. But right now, I'm going to start moving on to some other issues. So there's been a large narrative, I think, that people are often, and I'm going to start talking about the riots and the protests now, because there's a large narrative that why don't people just protest peacefully? Why don't they just peacefully protest? Why do people have to resort to looting and rioting, right? That doesn't make any sense. And I'm not going to stand here and say that looting and rioting are good things. They're obviously not. But I think they're an inevitable consequence of a system that doesn't listen to peaceful protests. And to exemplify this, I'm going to name some very high-profile incidents that caused mass protest, but fundamentally no change within the system, and is why we have this tragedy with George Floyd today, and tragedies such as Breonna Taylor's a few weeks past. So here's just a couple. Philando Castile in 2016 was shot by a police officer, unarmed, in 2016. The police officer was brought to trial, and it was handed down a not guilty verdict. Michael Brown Jr., not guilty verdict for the police officer involved, despite camera evidence showing that the person who was shot was unarmed and not threatening the police officer. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy, shot, not guilty for the police officer. Eric Garner, who was simply selling loose cigarettes on the street, and then the officer that killed him used a chokehold that was considered illegal by the NYPD. He died despite using an illegal chokehold, and all these things, and all this being on camera, was handed a not guilty verdict. And so is there any wonder that people are starting to think peaceful protests aren't enough, after peaceful protests after these incidents didn't cause things to change enough so that George Floyd would still be alive today? I think I think that is just part of the evidence that if there's a political and economic system within this country that does not seriously heed the cries of pain and help of those who are disadvantaged, time and time again, those people will eventually come to the conclusion that peaceful protests do not work, that they've failed, and that something else must be done in order, something else that's harsh enough to provoke a response. And so I think a lot of the looting and a lot of the rioting is a response to the fact that peaceful protests, time and time again, have not led to a change happening year after year after year. So I think that says quite a bit about the issue. But I am just a high schooler sitting behind their computer, talking about politics, and I think there is a source that is much, much, much more reliable than me on this. And so now I'm going to look at something that Martin Luther King Jr. said to the American Psychological Association in the 1960s, mind, that I think applies a lot today. And so this is MLK on urban riots within his speech. Urban riots must now be recognized as durable social phenomena. They may be deplored, but they are there and should be understood. Urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or to attain control of institutions. They are mainly intended to shock the white community. They are a distorted form of social protest. The looting, which is their principal feature, serves many functions. It enables the most enraged and deprived African American to take hold of consumer goods with the ease the white man does by using his purse. Often, the African American does not even know what he takes. He wants the experience of taking. But most of all, alienated from society and knowing that this society cherishes property above people, he is shocking it by abusing property rights. There are thus elements of emotional catharsis in the violent act. This may explain why most cities in which riots have occurred have not had a repetition, even though the causative conditions remain. It is also noteworthy that the amount of physical harm done to the white people, other than police, is infinitesimal, and in Detroit, whites and African Americans looted in unity. A profound judgment of today's rights was expressed by Victor Hugo a century ago. If a soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. The policymakers of the white society have caused the darkness. They create discrimination. They structured slums, and they perpetuate unemployment, ignorance, and poverty. It is incontestable and deplorable that African Americans have committed crimes, but they are derivative crimes. They are born of the greater crimes of the white society. When we ask African Americans to abide by the law, let us also demand that the white man abide by law in the ghettos. Day in and day out, he violates welfare laws to deprive the poor of their meager allotments. He flagrantly violates building codes and regulation. His police make a mockery of law, and he violates laws on equal employment and education and the provisions for civic services. The slums are the handiwork of a vicious system of the white society. African Americans live in them, but do not make them any more than a prisoner makes a prison. Let us say boldly that if the violations of law by the white man in the slums over the years were calculated and compared with the law breaking of a few days of riots, the hardened criminal would be the white man. These are often difficult things to say, but I have come to see more and more that it is necessary to utter the truth in order to deal with the great problems that we face in our society. This was written more than 50 years ago. And I think the fact that somebody with such a level of political power, somebody who had such a strong message that so many people heard, had these things to say, had this knowledge, but that things fundamentally did not change, proves why there's riots and looting happening right now. Not just in response to George Floyd, but in response to 52 years since this was said. 52 years where this message was put out and nothing was changed as a result. I think there's nothing really more I can say there. I think there's been a continuous problem, not just from police brutality, right? I think that's a central issue, but I think from economic inequality, from all of these problems that have continued for many, many years, we have this level of desperation among many people who have been oppressed and are rightful to stand up and protest against that. And I think this is why we have rioting and looting. And I think, you know, I understand that property damage is not a good thing. It's not a good thing. But I think the quote from Victor Hugo cited within here makes a good point. If a soul is left in the darkness, sins will be committed. Whoops. Yeah. If a soul is left in the darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sins, but he who causes the darkness. So, as an ending message, next time you go on your phone and you see some video of either on TV or on social media of looting and riots and of peaceful protests as well, the question that should be coming to mind is not why are the rioters doing this? It's as if it's the fault of the rioters for causing this damage. The question should be what happened so that these people who are rioting, these oppressed peoples, thought that the only solution to their problems was the only way they could solve these problems was to go out and loot and burn. I think that's the question that should be asked. The question should be asked, what happened so that peaceful protest no longer seemed a feasible option? That after years of peaceful protest, people finally got fed up and said enough is enough. I think that's the question we should be asking. And that's a question I'm going to try to cover more in later videos, but I think that's it for today. So, stay informed, read up, support Black Lives Matter however you can. Please look down in the description not only for articles, but for links for organizations where you can donate to help with bail. As I said, we have a terrible cash bail system, and anybody who's arrested for protesting has to have their bail paid to be able to walk free and rather than sit in jail. So donating to Cash Bail Project is a super big deal. Donate to Black Lives Matter. All of that is super important. All the links will be in the description. Please go check out there. Well, thank you so much for watching, and please tune in within the next couple days to see more. Thank you.